The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Sergeant Michael Thompson adjusted his red tunic and checked his ceremonial rifle one final time. After 15 years serving in the Queen's Guard, the routine had become second nature, but he never took his duty lightly. The weight of tradition rested on his shoulders, and thousands of tourists would watch his every move throughout the day. Michael had joined the Guard straight from his small hometown in Yorkshire, driven by a deep sense of duty and respect for the crown. His father had served before him and his grandfather before that. The Thompson family had a proud military tradition that stretched back generations. Standing guard at the palace wasn't just a job for Michael, it was a calling that connected him to something greater than himself. As the morning shift began, Michael took his position at the main gate. The familiar sounds of London awakened around him, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of early morning joggers in St. James's Park, and the clicking of cameras as the first tourists began to gather. He stood perfectly still, his face expressionless beneath the iconic bearskin hat, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced vigilance. The tourists came in waves throughout the morning. Families from America posed for photos. Japanese visitors bowed respectfully, and British schoolchildren giggled as their teachers explained the significance of the Queen's Guard. Michael had seen it all before, the attempts to make him laugh, the questions shouted in his direction, the occasional inappropriate behavior that required a stern word from the police officers nearby. But something felt different today. As noon approached, Michael noticed an unusual tension in the air. The crowd seemed more restless than usual, and he caught glimpses of a white van that had been circling the area for the past hour. His training had taught him to notice patterns, to identify potential threats before they materialized. The van's repeated appearances around the palace grounds raised red flags in his mind. Michael's attention was drawn to a small commotion near the edge of the crowd. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, had become separated from what appeared to be a school group. She had curly blonde hair tied in pigtails and wore a bright blue school uniform with a small backpack. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked around frantically for familiar faces. The child's obvious distress tugged at Michael's heart, but his position required him to remain stationary unless there was a direct threat. The crowd around the girl seemed oblivious to her situation. Adults were busy taking photos and chatting among themselves, while other children in various school groups were too engaged with the spectacle of the guards to notice one missing classmate. The little girl began to wander, her panic growing more evident with each passing moment. She called out what sounded like Miss Sarah repeatedly, presumably looking for her teacher. That's when Michael noticed the white van had pulled up near the edge of the crowd, uncomfortably close to where the little girl was wandering. 2 men had gotten out, and while they appeared to be dressed casually like tourists, something about their behavior struck him as wrong. They were moving deliberately toward the child. Their eyes focused intently on her rather than on the palace or the guards like genuine tourists would be. Michael's years of training kicked in as he assessed the situation rapidly. The men's body language was predatory. They moved with purpose, constantly checking their surroundings, and one kept glancing back at the van. The driver remained behind the wheel with the engine running, another red flag that set Michael's instincts on high alert. This wasn't random, opportunistic behavior. It appeared to be a coordinated operation. The little girl had wandered even further from the main crowd now, her tears making it difficult for her to see clearly. She was heading directly toward the 2 men, who had positioned themselves to intercept her path. Michael realized that within moments, they would be close enough to grab her and potentially get her to the van. Before anyone in the distracted crowd noticed what had happened, protocol dictated that Michael should alert the police officers stationed nearby, but they were dealing with an unrelated incident involving some rowdy teenagers on the other side of the courtyard. By the time he could get their attention and they could respond, it might be too late. The little girl was now only yards away from the 2 men, and Michael could see them preparing to make their move. In that critical moment, Michael faced a decision that would define not only his career, but potentially save a child's life. Breaking position as a Queen's Guard was unprecedented and could result in serious disciplinary action. The rigid traditions and protocols he had sworn to uphold seemed to conflict with his moral obligation to protect an innocent child in immediate danger. The little girl stumbled slightly, her shoe having come untied, and she bent down to fix it just a few feet away from the two men. They exchanged a look and began to close the distance. Michael could see the determination in their eyes and knew that once they reached her, there would be no stopping what was about to happen. The van's engine revved slightly, and the driver adjusted his position for a quick getaway. Michael's mind raced through his options. He could shout to alert others, but that might startle the girl into running directly toward danger. He could try to signal the police, but they were still occupied and might not understand the urgency of the situation. Every second counted, and the traditional response mechanism seemed inadequate for the speed at which events were unfolding. As the two men took their final steps toward the unsuspecting child, Michael made a decision that would shock everyone present and set in motion a chain of events that would be talked about for years to come. The weight of his responsibility as both a Queen's Guard and a human being crystallized in that moment, and he knew exactly what he had to do, regardless of the consequences to his career or the breach of protocol it would represent. Without hesitation, Michael broke from his position and strode directly toward the little girl with long, purposeful steps. His sudden movement sent a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd. Tourists gasped and pointed, cameras swiveled, to capture this unprecedented moment, and confused murmurs spread like wildfire among the onlookers. In over a century of the Queen's Guard tradition, no one could remember a guard abandoning his post during active duty. The two men approaching the child froze when they saw the imposing figure of the Royal Guard moving toward them. Michael's red tunic blazed in the sunlight, his bearskin hat making him appear even taller and more intimidating than his natural 6-foot frame. The ceremonial rifle in his hands, while not loaded, carried enough symbolic authority to make anyone think twice about their actions. "Sarah, there you are!" Michael called out in a loud, clear voice as he approached the little girl. His tone was warm but carried enough volume to ensure everyone nearby could hear. The child looked up in confusion, tears still streaming down her face, but something in Michael's kind eyes seemed to reassure her instantly. He had a daughter of his own back home, and he knew how to speak to frightened children. The two suspicious men exchanged nervous glances. Their carefully planned approach had been completely disrupted by this unexpected intervention. They had counted on anonymity in the crowd, on being able to operate without drawing attention. The presence of a Queen's Guard, the most recognizable and respected law enforcement symbol in Britain, had turned their covert operation into a very public spectacle. Michael knelt down to the little girl's level, his rifle carefully positioned away from her. Despite breaking protocol, his years of training ensured he never compromised safety procedures. The child's name tag read Emma, and he could see she was part of a school group from Manchester, based on the badge on her uniform. "Emma, is it?" Michael asked gently. "I'm here to help you find your teacher. Miss Sarah is looking everywhere for you." The little girl nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. She seemed calmer now, the presence of the uniformed guard, providing the security and authority figure she desperately needed in her moment of panic. The crowd had grown significantly larger, drawn by the unusual sight of a Queen's Guard interacting with a member of the public. Phones and cameras captured every moment, and Michael knew that within hours, footage of this incident would be circulating worldwide on social media. His commanding officers would see it, the media would pick it up, and there would be serious questions about his decision to abandon his post. But Michael's attention remained focused on the two men, who were now trying to blend back into the crowd. They had started moving away from Emma, but they weren't leaving the area entirely. Instead, they seemed to be repositioning themselves, perhaps waiting for another opportunity, or looking for a different target. Michael's instincts told him these men weren't giving up easily. "Emma, can you describe what Miss Sarah looks like?" Michael asked, keeping his voice steady and reassuring while his eyes tracked the movements of the suspicious individuals. The little girl began to describe her teacher, tall, brown hair, wearing a green jacket, and Michael scanned the crowd for someone matching that description. The police officers who had been dealing with the teenage troublemakers finally noticed the commotion around Michael's position. They began making their way through the crowd, their expressions showing a mixture of concern and confusion. Breaking position as a Queen's Guard was such an unprecedented event that they weren't sure how to respond. Protocol demanded they maintain order, but Michael was clearly helping a lost child. Meanwhile, the white van had moved closer to the edge of the crowd. The driver kept the engine running, and Michael could see him speaking into what appeared to be a radio or cell phone. This confirmed his suspicion that this was an organized operation, not a random opportunity crime. The coordination between the men on foot and the driver indicated they had planned this carefully. Michael spotted a woman in a green jacket frantically, searching through the crowd about 50 meters away. She was calling out Emma and looked distressed. Several other children in the same Manchester school uniform were clustered around her, and Michael realized this had to be Miss Sarah. The teacher was moving systematically through the crowd, clearly following a search pattern. "Emma, I think I can see Miss Sarah," Michael said, pointing in the teacher's direction. "She's over there by the big statue and she's looking for you." The little girl's face lit up with relief, and she started to wave excitedly. The teacher spotted the movement and began hurrying toward them, her expression transforming from worry to overwhelming relief. But as Miss Sarah approached, Michael noticed that the two suspicious men had started moving again. They seemed to realize that their original target was about to be reunited with her group, making any attempt to take her much more difficult. However, instead of leaving the area, they appeared to be scanning the crowd for other opportunities. Michael's blood ran cold as he realized they might be looking for another vulnerable child. The teacher reached them, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Emma, thank goodness you're safe," she exclaimed, wrapping the little girl in a tight hug. She turned to Michael with gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you so much, sir. I don't know how to repay you." When I turned around and she was gone, her voice broke with emotion. "Just doing my duty, ma'am," Michael replied, but his attention was divided between the reunion and tracking the movements of the two men. They had positioned themselves near another school group, and Michael watched, with growing alarm as they seemed to be observing the children with the same predatory focus they had shown toward Emma. The police officers finally reached Michael's position, their faces stern with the weight of protocol violations they would need to address. "Sergeant Thompson," one of them began formally, "you'll need to return to your position immediately. We'll handle the situation from here." But Michael knew something the police didn't yet understand. The threat hadn't ended with Emma's rescue. It had simply shifted to other potential victims. The organized nature of what he had witnessed suggested these men were experienced and determined. They wouldn't be deterred by one failed attempt, and there were dozens of schoolchildren in the area who could become targets. As Miss Sarah led Emma back toward her school group, Michael faced another critical decision. He could return to his post as ordered and hope the police would take his concerns seriously, or he could continue to act on what he knew to be a clear and present danger to other children in the area. The weight of tradition and protocol pulled him in one direction, while his conscience and professional judgment pulled him in another. Michael turned to the police officers with urgency in his voice, though he maintained the disciplined composure that 15 years of service had ingrained in him. "Officers, I need you to listen carefully." Those two men in casual clothes near the fountain. They were coordinating an approach on the child I just helped. There's a white van with a driver maintaining position for what appears to be a quick escape. This was a planned operation. The senior police officer, Constable Williams, looked skeptical at first. Guards were trained observers, but this seemed like an extraordinary claim. However, Michael's reputation preceded him. He was known among the palace security staff as one of the most reliable and level-headed members of the Queen's Guard. His 15 years of service without a single disciplinary action carried weight. "Are you certain about this assessment, Sergeant?" Williams asked, his tone shifting from reprimand to professional concern. Michael nodded firmly, his eyes never leaving the two suspicious individuals who were now positioning themselves near a group of children from a Birmingham school. "Absolutely certain. Military training, sir? I've seen coordinated operations before. The timing, positioning, communication with their driver. This isn't opportunistic behavior. They're hunting." Michael's use of military terminology conveyed the seriousness of his assessment. Williams followed Michael's gaze and began to observe the men's behavior with fresh eyes. What the police officer saw began to confirm Michael's suspicions. The two men were indeed moving with unusual purpose through the crowd. Unlike genuine tourists who would be taking photos, reading information plaques or showing general interest in the palace. These individuals were focused exclusively on the children. They would approach a school group, observe for a few minutes, then move on to the next one. Williams spoke quietly into his radio, calling for backup while keeping his eyes on the suspects. "This is Williams at the palace main gate. We have a potential code yellow situation involving suspicious adults targeting school groups, requesting immediate tactical support and surveillance on a white van. License plate." He squinted toward the vehicle and began reading off the registration number. Meanwhile, Michael realized he was in an unprecedented situation. He had broken protocol to help Emma, but returning to his rigid ceremonial position now felt impossible when he could see another potential crime developing. The bureaucratic procedures of law enforcement, while necessary, moved too slowly for the immediate threat he was observing. The two men had settled near the Birmingham school group, where about 20 children aged between 6 and 8 were gathered around their teacher for a group photo. Michael watched as one of the men positioned himself behind the children, while his partner moved to the side, creating what looked suspiciously like a pincer movement designed to isolate a target. "They're making another approach," Michael informed Williams urgently. The police officer looked toward the school group and saw what Michael meant. One of the suspects was now crouching down, pretending to tie his shoe, but his position would allow him to grab any child who wandered just a few steps away from the main group. Williams began moving toward the school group, but the crowd was thick and his progress was slow. Michael calculated that it would take the officer at least 2 minutes to reach the children, and the suspects appeared ready to make their move within seconds. A little boy had become distracted by a pigeon and was gradually moving away from his classmates toward the waiting man. The internal struggle Michael faced was unlike anything in his military career. In combat situations, the rules of engagement were clear, and the enemy was obvious. But this was peacetime London, in front of hundreds of tourists, and he was bound by ceremonial duties that had never contemplated this scenario. Yet his oath as a soldier was to protect the innocent, and that oath transcended any ceremonial protocol. Michael made his second unprecedented decision of the day. He began moving through the crowd toward the school group, his distinctive uniform parting the sea of tourists like a ship cutting through water. The reaction was immediate and dramatic: gasps, pointing, and a surge of camera phones recording this historic breach of CrownGuard tradition. "Young man," Michael called out in his commanding military voice as he approached the little boy who was drifting toward danger. "Your teacher needs everyone to stay close for the photo." His tone was authoritative but kind, exactly the voice of authority that children were taught to respect and obey. The little boy looked up at the impressive figure of the Queen's Guard and immediately scampered back to his group. The teacher, initially startled by the guard's intervention, quickly understood that something serious was happening and began gathering her students more tightly around her. The suspect, who had been positioning himself to grab the child, found himself face to face with Michael, whose imposing presence and ceremonial rifle made any aggressive action unthinkable. The man tried to act casual, standing up and brushing off his clothes, but his nervous energy was palpable. Michael stood his ground, maintaining eye contact with the suspect in a clear display of awareness and deterrence. "Beautiful day for sightseeing," the man said, attempting to sound like a normal tourist. His accent was rough, possibly Eastern European, and his clothes, while clean, had the worn quality of someone who spent time on the streets rather than in an office. "Indeed," Michael replied curtly, his posture and tone conveying that he was not fooled by the man's performance. "Though I notice you haven't taken any photos yet. Most tourists are quite interested in capturing memories of their visit." The comment was pointed. Michael had been watching, and the man hadn't shown any genuine tourist behavior. The second suspect, realizing their operation was compromised, began moving toward the white van. He spoke into a small radio device, presumably warning his accomplices that they needed to abort their mission. Michael caught the movement in his peripheral vision, but maintained his focus on the immediate threat near the children. Williams finally reached the school group, slightly out of breath from pushing through the crowd. Behind him, 2 additional police officers were approaching, drawn by the radio call for backup. The teacher of the Birmingham group looked confused but cooperative, as Williams quietly explained that they needed to move the children to a different area for their safety. The Suspect facing Michael realized the situation was deteriorating rapidly. More police were arriving, the children were being moved to safety, and a Queen's Guard was standing directly in front of him as a witness to his attempted crime. He began backing away, trying to create distance between himself and the growing law enforcement presence. "Going somewhere?" Michael asked, stepping forward to maintain the distance between them. His military training included crowd control and detainment techniques, and while he wasn't technically a police officer in this situation, his authority as a member of Her Majesty's forces carried significant legal weight. The suspect's composure cracked under Michael's unwavering stare. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool London air, and his eyes darted nervously between the approaching police officers and the exit routes from the palace grounds. He took another step backward, but Michael matched his movement, maintaining the psychological pressure that his imposing presence created. "I'm just a tourist," the man insisted, his voice rising slightly with stress. "I don't know what you think you saw, but I'm just here to see the palace like everyone else." His protest drew the attention of nearby tourists, who began to sense that something significant was happening. The crowd started forming a loose circle around the confrontation, phones recording every moment. Williams reached Michael's position with backup officers flanking him. "Sir," he addressed the suspect formally, "we'd like to ask you a few questions about your activities here today. Would you mind accompanying us to a quieter area?" The request was polite but carried the unmistakable weight of authority that made refusal inadvisable. The man looked trapped, his eyes searching desperately for an escape route. The white van was still visible in the distance, but reaching it would mean pushing through a crowd of tourists and several police officers. His partner had already disappeared into the crowd, presumably making his own escape, and the van's engine noise suggested it was preparing to leave without him. "I don't have to answer any questions," the suspect declared, but his voice lacked conviction. Michael noticed the man's hands were shaking slightly, and his breathing had become shallow, classic signs of someone under extreme stress who is close to making a desperate decision. "That's your right, sir," Williams replied calmly, "but I should inform you that we have witnesses who observed you engaging in suspicious behavior around children. We can do this the easy way with a voluntary conversation, or we can proceed with a formal investigation. Your choice." The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the unprecedented sight of a Queen's Guard involved in what appeared to be an arrest situation. Michael was acutely aware that this entire incident was being recorded from multiple angles and would soon be shared across social media platforms worldwide. His career, his family's reputation, and the dignity of the Queen's Guard were all at stake. Suddenly, the suspect made his move. Instead of complying with the police request, he pushed hard against one of the tourists and began running toward the palace gates. His sudden action caused chaos in the crowd. People screamed, scattered, and several elderly visitors fell as the man shoved his way through them in desperation. Michael's military instincts took over completely. He could see the suspect's trajectory would take him past several more school groups, and his panicked state made him dangerous to everyone in his path. Without hesitation, Michael began pursuit, his long legs and superior physical conditioning allowing him to gain ground quickly. Despite the heavy ceremonial uniform, the sight of a Queen's Guard in full regalia chasing a suspect through the crowds was surreal and unprecedented. Tourists pressed themselves against walls and barriers to get out of the way, while others held up phones to capture this historic moment. The red tunic flowed behind Michael like a cape as he navigated through the crowd with practiced precision. Williams and his team followed behind, coordinating with other security personnel through their radios. The palace grounds went into immediate lockdown protocol. Gates were secured, and additional guards appeared at key positions to prevent the suspect from accessing restricted areas or endangering the royal family. The suspect's desperation led him to make poor decisions. Instead of heading for the main exit where he might have escaped into London's busy streets, he ran toward the more secure inner areas of the palace grounds where escape was impossible. His unfamiliarity with the layout became obvious as he found himself running toward dead ends and secured barriers. Michael cornered him near the Victoria Memorial, where the suspect finally realized he had nowhere left to run. Breathing heavily from the chase, the man turned to face Michael with the wild look of someone who had nothing left to lose. The ceremonial nature of Michael's rifle meant it wasn't loaded, but the suspect didn't know that, and the weapon's presence added to the intimidation factor. "It's over," Michael said firmly, not even breathing hard despite the chase. His military conditioning kept him in excellent physical shape, and the adrenaline of protecting children had energized rather than exhausted him. "There's nowhere to go and you're surrounded by police officers. The smart thing to do is surrender peacefully." The suspect looked around wildly, confirming what Michael had said. Williams and his team had formed a loose perimeter, and additional security personnel were approaching from multiple directions. The white van was now gone, having fled when the situation deteriorated, leaving the man completely isolated. "You don't understand," the suspect said desperately. "I wasn't going to hurt anyone. We were just—" It wasn't what it looked like. His explanation was vague and unconvincing, the words of someone trying to minimize culpability without admitting to actual crimes. Michael stepped closer, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had used with soldiers under his command. "What I understand is that you and your partners were targeting children with coordinated tactics. What I understand is that you had a getaway vehicle ready and were selecting victims based on their vulnerability. What I understand is that, but for intervention, a little girl would be missing right now." The suspect's shoulders sagged as he realized the futility of his situation. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, video recordings, and the testimony of a decorated member of the Queen's Guard, whose word carried enormous credibility in any British court. Williams approached cautiously, handcuffs ready. "Sir, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of attempted kidnapping and child endangerment. You have the right to remain silent." As the police officer began the formal arrest procedure, the suspect finally stopped resisting and allowed himself to be taken into custody. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but many lingered to congratulate Michael on his actions. Children who had witnessed the chase looked at him with awe, seeing him not just as a ceremonial figure but as a real hero who had protected them. Their teachers approached to express their gratitude, some with tears in their eyes as they realized how close they had come to a tragedy. But Michael's thoughts were already turning to the consequences of his actions. He had abandoned his post twice, engaged in pursuit of a suspect, and created an international incident that would require explanation at the highest levels of military command. The immediate crisis was over, but the personal reckoning was just beginning. Within an hour of the arrest, news vans had arrived outside Buckingham Palace, and reporters were already broadcasting live updates about the unprecedented incident involving the Queen's Guard. Social media exploded with videos taken by tourists, each showing different angles of Michael's intervention and subsequent chase. The hashtag #HeroGuard was trending worldwide, with millions of people sharing and commenting on the extraordinary events. Inside the palace security offices, Michael sat in an uncomfortable wooden chair, still wearing his ceremonial uniform but with his bearskin hat removed and placed carefully on the table beside him. His commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Davies, paced back and forth behind her desk, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the preliminary reports from the police investigation. 15 years of exemplary service, she began, her voice controlled but tense. And then you decide to rewrite a century of protocol in a single afternoon. She stopped pacing and faced Michael directly. "Do you understand the magnitude of what you've done? The Queen's Guard does not abandon post. The Queen's Guard does not engage in crowd control. The Queen's Guard certainly does not chase suspects through public areas while in ceremonial dress." Michael remained at attention, his eyes fixed straight ahead as military protocol demanded. "Yes, ma'am. I understand the gravity of my actions and accept full responsibility for any disciplinary measures deemed appropriate." Colonel Davies studied his face, searching for any sign of regret or doubt about his decisions. What she saw instead was the same steady resolve that had made Michael one of her most trusted sergeants. His jaw was set with quiet determination, and his eyes held no hint of apology for protecting innocent children. "The media is calling you a hero," she continued, placing several printed news articles on her desk. "The children you protected have been interviewed. Their parents are calling you a blessing. And there's a petition online with 50,000 signatures demanding you receive a commendation rather than punishment." She paused, letting the weight of public opinion settle in the room. "However," Colonel Davies continued, her tone sharpening, "public opinion doesn't govern military discipline. Rules exist for reasons that go beyond individual circumstances, no matter how compelling. If every guard decided to abandon their post whenever they felt justified, the entire foundation of our ceremonial duties would collapse. A knock at the door interrupted her lecture. "Enter," she called, and William stepped into the office, followed by a woman in a dark suit whom Michael didn't recognize. The woman's professional bearing and confident demeanor suggested she held significant authority, though her identity remained unclear. "Colonel Davies," Williams began formally, "I'd like to provide an update on our investigation. The suspect we arrested has been identified as Viktor Petrov, a known associate of an international child trafficking ring. Under questioning, he admitted that he and his partners were specifically targeting isolated children from school groups, visiting tourist locations around London." The woman in the suit stepped forward. "I'm Detective Inspector Sarah Chen from the Metropolitan Police's Serious Crime Unit. We've been tracking this trafficking network for 8 months. Sergeant Thompson's intervention today likely prevented multiple kidnappings and provided us with our first concrete evidence to dismantle their operation." Michael's expression remained neutral, but internally he felt a surge of validation. His instincts had been correct, and his decision to break protocol had prevented a genuine tragedy. The military training that had taught him to assess threats and take decisive action had served him well. Even in this unprecedented civilian context, Detective Inspector Chen continued, "The white van was intercepted attempting to leave London, and we arrested 2 additional suspects. Inside the vehicle we found restraints, sedatives, and detailed surveillance photos of various London tourist attractions frequented by school groups. This was a sophisticated operation that could have resulted in multiple missing children, if not for the sergeant's quick thinking." Colonel Davies absorbed this information with growing understanding. The situation was far more serious than a simple case of a guard helping a lost child. Michael had identified and disrupted an active criminal conspiracy that posed a genuine threat to public safety. Furthermore, Detective Inspector Chen added, "Petrov has provided information about similar operations planned for Edinburgh and Cardiff. Sergeant Thompson's actions today may have prevented kidnappings across the entire United Kingdom." The room fell silent as the full implications of Michael's intervention became clear. What had initially appeared to be a breach of military discipline was actually a textbook example of a soldier's duty to protect civilians from immediate danger. The traditional protocols of the Queen's Guard, while important, had never been designed to address this type of modern criminal threat. Williams spoke up again. "Ma'am, I should also mention that Sergeant Thompson's observations and tactical assessment were absolutely correct. His military training allowed him to identify threat patterns that civilian observers missed. Without his intervention, we would likely be dealing with missing children rather than arrested suspects." Colonel Davies returned to her chair, the weight of command decisions settling on her shoulders. The public relations implications were enormous. Punishing a guard who had prevented child kidnappings would create a public relations disaster for the military. But allowing guards to abandon their posts, even for heroic reasons, could undermine the discipline and tradition that made the Queen's Guard effective. "Sergeant Thompson," she addressed him directly, "you placed me in an impossible position today. Your actions were simultaneously a violation of military protocol and a heroic intervention that saved innocent lives. How do you suggest I reconcile these conflicting realities?" Michael considered his response carefully. "Ma'am, I believe the oath we take as soldiers includes a fundamental duty to protect the innocent that transcends ceremonial obligations. If faced with the same circumstances again, I would make the same choices regardless of personal consequences." His honesty was both refreshing and problematic. He wasn't seeking forgiveness or making excuses. He was stating clearly that his moral compass would guide his actions, even when they conflicted with formal protocols. It was the response of a soldier rather than a ceremonial guard, and it forced Colonel Davies to consider what the Queen's Guard truly represented. Detective Inspector Chen interjected with information that would prove crucial to the final resolution. "Colonel, I've been authorized to inform you that this case has reached the attention of the Prime Minister's office. Given the international implications of the trafficking ring and the positive public response to Sergeant Thompson's actions, there's considerable interest in handling this matter appropriately." The mention of political involvement changed the entire dynamic of the situation. What had begun as an internal military discipline issue had become a matter of national security and public policy. The decision about Michael's fate would now be made at levels far above Colonel Davies's authority. 3 days later, Michael stood once again in his dress uniform, but this time in the opulent surroundings of Windsor Castle's grand reception hall. The morning light streamed through ancient stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the polished marble floors. He had been summoned for what his commanding officers had described only as a meeting of considerable importance, leaving him to wonder whether he was about to face court-martial or commendation. The events of the past 72 hours had been a whirlwind of media attention, public support, and behind-the-scenes negotiations between military leadership, government officials, and palace administrators. Michael had been temporarily relieved of guard duty, pending the outcome of multiple investigations, spending his time giving detailed statements to police detectives and military investigators. The arrest of the trafficking ring had revealed the scope of their operations far exceeded what anyone had initially suspected. Detective Inspector Chen had briefed Michael that Petrov and his associates had been responsible for 17 missing children across Europe over the past 2 years. The evidence found in their possession included detailed surveillance of schools, playgrounds, and tourist attractions in 6 different countries. A door at the far end of the reception hall opened, and Michael's breath caught as he recognized the figure entering the room. Her Majesty the Queen, accompanied by a small entourage of officials, walked with the measured dignity that had defined her decades of service. Michael immediately came to attention and executed a perfect military salute, his years of training taking over despite his amazement at finding himself in the monarch's presence. "Sergeant Thompson," the Queen began, her voice carrying the warmth and authority that had guided the nation for generations, "you may stand at ease. I've asked to meet with you personally to discuss the extraordinary events of this week." Michael relaxed his posture slightly, but remained respectfully formal. "Your Majesty, it is an honor beyond measure to be in your presence." "The honor," she replied with a slight smile, "belongs to those who serve with courage and moral clarity when faced with difficult choices. I am told that you prevented a great tragedy while upholding the finest traditions of British military service." Behind the Queen, Michael recognized several familiar faces: Colonel Davies, Detective Inspector Chen, and a man in formal diplomatic attire whom he didn't know, but who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to high-level government service. The Queen continued, "Your actions have raised important questions about the role of the Queen's Guard in modern times. While the ceremonial aspects of your duties remain vital to our national heritage, recent events have highlighted the need for adaptation when genuine threats to public safety arise." The diplomatic official stepped forward. "Sergeant Thompson, I'm Sir James Morrison from the Foreign Office. The trafficking ring you helped dismantle had connections to criminal organizations in 12 countries. Your intervention has provided intelligence that will protect children across the European Union and beyond." Michael absorbed this information with growing understanding of how significant the incident had become. What he had viewed as a straightforward decision to protect a child had evolved into an international law enforcement operation with diplomatic implications, spanning multiple nations. "The question before us," the Queen continued, "is how to honor your service while maintaining the discipline and tradition essential to the Queen's Guard. After consultation with military leadership and government officials, we have reached a decision that we believe serves both purposes." Colonel Davies stepped forward with a formal document. "Sergeant Thompson, you are hereby promoted to the rank of Warrant Officer and appointed as Special Security Liaison for the Queen's Guard. Your new role will involve training guards to identify and respond to modern security threats while maintaining ceremonial protocols." The promotion was unexpected and significant. Warrant Officer was a position of considerable authority and respect within the military hierarchy, typically reserved for the most experienced and trusted soldiers. The creation of a new role specifically for him suggested that the military had decided his skills were too valuable to lose to disciplinary action. The Queen smiled as she observed Michael's stunned expression. "Additionally, you are awarded the Queen's Commendation for Bravery in recognition of your courage in protecting innocent civilians at considerable personal risk. This honor will be recorded in your permanent military record and announced publicly to acknowledge your extraordinary service. Detective Inspector Chen added, "The Metropolitan Police has also requested that you serve as a consultant on security matters related to tourist areas and public events. Your ability to identify threats in crowd situations has proven invaluable." Michael felt overwhelmed by the recognition and responsibility being placed on his shoulders. "Your Majesty, I am deeply grateful for this honor, but I must say that I was simply doing what my conscience and training demanded."
Any member of the Queen's Guard would have acted similarly when faced with the threat to those children. "Perhaps," the Queen replied thoughtfully.
"But you were the one who recognized the danger and had the courage to act despite the potential consequences. Leadership often requires making difficult decisions when the safe course of action conflicts with what is right." Sir Morrison presented another document. "Your new position will also involve coordinating with international law enforcement agencies to share intelligence about threats to children at tourist locations. The trafficking ring you exposed was planning similar operations at Windsor Castle, Edinburgh Castle, and the Tower of London. Your expertise will help protect vulnerable visitors at royal and historic sites worldwide." The scope of his new responsibilities was both exciting and daunting. Michael had joined the Queen's Guard to serve his country in a traditional military role, but events had thrust him into a position where his service would extend far beyond ceremonial duties to active protection of children and families from around the world. "There is one final matter," the Queen said, her expression becoming more serious. "Your actions have changed public perception of what the Queen's Guard represents. You have shown that our traditions can evolve to meet modern challenges while maintaining their essential character. This is both an honor and a burden that will follow you throughout your career." As the formal ceremony concluded, Michael reflected on the path that had brought him to this moment. A single decision to help a frightened little girl had transformed his life and career in ways he could never have imagined. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to make a lasting difference in protecting innocent people. Walking out of Windsor Castle in his new role, Michael understood that his story would inspire other guards to trust their instincts and moral judgment, even when it meant challenging established protocols. The Queen's Guard would continue to honor tradition while adapting to serve the people they were sworn to protect, and he would play a central role in that evolution. The little girl named Emma, now safe with her family in Manchester, would never fully understand how her rescue had changed the institution of the Queen's Guard forever. But for Michael, carrying the weight of new rank and responsibility, her safety and the protection of countless other children would always be worth any personal cost he had paid to achieve it.